People are killing themselves because of this. And we're not just talking about erectile dysfunction. People think, oh, PSSD, they just think sexual dysfunction, they think of that. We have a pill for that. No, we're talking about identity loss, relational breakdowns, complete disruption of one's future plans or dreams. Yeah. And the harm, it's not just biological, it's also psychological and social. When somebody's reality is denied by the world around them, by the prescriber, by the people who are meant to support them, that compounds trauma. And so people are not just left with that debilitating condition, they're also left questioning their reality, right. Their sanity. Right. And I wish people knew the impacts of what can happen when people are gaslit in their grief.
Today's guest is Yassie, a therapist, educator, and advocate specializing in PSSD and iatrogenic harm. She works directly with sufferers, families, and clinicians to raise awareness about persistent side effects from medications like SSRIs, Finasteride, and even some herbal supplements. Her work is grounded in trauma-informed care and social justice, and she's a leading voice pushing for recognition, research, and reform in modern psychiatry. This conversation is powerful. Let's get into it. Yeah, the first one is actually perfect. Can you give a little overview on your professional background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a therapist, I'm a consultant and educator with a specialized focus on PSSD, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. I also work with people with other iatrogenic conditions, meaning conditions caused by medical treatment, and that includes things like post-Finasteride syndrome, persistent effects from different herbal supplements like ashwagandha and St. John's wort that create long-term harm in some folks. So I support folks who are living with these conditions, and also sometimes their family members, because the impact can reverberate through relationships and social networks. Alongside that, I consult with clinicians who are trying to better understand how to support people with these conditions. My training's in social work, which means I come to this with a systemic lens. So I'm not just trained to look at individual suffering, but to understand how broader systems, medical systems, regulatory structures, pharmaceutical industries contribute to harm. So that training made me deeply aware of how people's experiences can be invalidated and minimized interpersonally, but also structurally. So yeah, my role is multi-dimensional. I provide direct support to individuals, but also engage in education, research, and advocacy to push for recognition, research funding, and better informed consent practices. I've had the opportunity to present to clinical and academic audiences to raise awareness, because until there's a cultural shift within medicine itself, the harms are going to continue to fly under the radar.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually leads perfectly into our next question. So what initially led you to become involved in advocacy for PSSD and iatrogenic harm? And was there a specific moment or story that changed how you viewed these issues?
Yeah, so I started hearing directly from people who were affected. I started having clients describe these devastating persistent symptoms that developed after taking or stopping these drugs, or sometimes while on the medication. And these were problems that just weren't being acknowledged in clinical spaces. And what struck me was not only the severity of the harm, things like genital numbness, emotional amputation, cognitive dysfunction, but the fact that people were just being utterly dismissed when they tried to seek help, despite the dramatic and distinct clinical presentation. The double wound, the double injury, the harm from the medication itself, and then the invalidation afterwards was deeply disturbing to me. And coming from a background in the sexual violence field, I was really impacted by people who described PSSD as a violation of their bodily autonomy, likening it to other forms of sexual trauma. The power and authority differentials involved, the dynamics around consent, and the shame experienced when speaking out, the societal minimization, all of these parallels to the sexual violence world, except that the sexual violence is happening within the medical system. And the deep parallels also to forced sterilization, which is a really dark part of Canadian history and government policy. Another shift just came when I realized, okay, this isn't just about individual cases, it's a systemic issue. The way our medical systems operate, and the lack of rigorous post-market surveillance, the cultural bias dismissing patients when their experiences don't neatly fit into pre-existing diagnostic categories and boxes, all of that keeps this harm invisible. So hearing the stories combined with my own kind of orientation towards social justice and systemic thinking pushed me into advocacy. The first patient I spoke with I first became aware of PSSD when I had a client who courageously shared with me that she'd started Zoloft before puberty and was on Zoloft for the entirety of puberty. And it wasn't until her 30s, several years after she stopped the drug, where she found out about PSSD. And yeah, she was really struck when she had found out that SSRIs are prescribed to sex offenders to curb their libido, and started wondering what happens when you put an 11-year-old on these drugs before and during development. And so when she found out about PSSD, finally made her whole life make sense to her, and she learned why her sexual development had been fundamentally altered. She could feel attraction and arousal, but her body just didn't respond in a normal way, and as compared to her peers. And so, she lived with persistent genital numbness and inability to orgasm and a range of other symptoms. So I supported her to fill out a adverse drug report, and I went through that process of supporting her to get recognized and diagnosed, etc.
Right. Just out of curiosity, with that particular situation, did she not connect the dots to her medication until 30 years later after she started taking it? I mean, she had no idea maybe what had happened to her.
Yeah. So she was 30 years old. She'd been off of the drug for 6 years already. And that was finally when she flew in. So for her whole life, she just didn't know why her body was so different compared to her peers, and always kind of wondered what was going on. And
I think a lot of people who get put on those medications at such a young age, they don't know what normal sexual development is supposed to feel like, and so you don't really know what you've lost in some sense until you said she was 30 when she kind of connected the dots and figured it out.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I think that just seems like it's so widespread. And I know the prescription for SSRIs are just going up for younger individuals as well.
Yeah.
Why do you think the medical system is in so much denial of all this?
I think there's a range of reasons. And I would say, there's multiple factors at play. There's a lack of research. If something isn't studied enough, it almost doesn't exist in the eyes of medicine. If it doesn't show up in an RCT or it doesn't have clear diagnostic and distinction testing, it's just not given the same weight. We have enough research on PSSD to qualify for better pharmacovigilance, policy and informed consent warnings, and treatment research, et cetera. But just the standard of evidence needed isn't high enough. And there's a sort of scientific chauvinism in medicine, I find, when it comes to these things, as well as a lack of epistemic humility, which is the practice of just recognizing the limits to our knowledge and being open to revising our beliefs with new evidence. Our perspectives arise. And then, of course, there's a stigma around sexual dysfunction. People are often too ashamed to talk about it, especially when clinicians are so dismissive. It just takes one experience of being trivialized or minimized for people to completely shut down and not want to speak to anybody about it and seek help. And when people do bring it up, the default assumption can be is that it's psychological or it's just depression. And that can, feel like gaslighting for people. And also people aren't convinced that going to a doctor is going to help with treatment or just for symptom resolution. So the motivation to go and speak to a doctor about it can be really low, because there's not exactly a lot of stories out there about people having miracle cures from talking to their doctor. And then you also have the pharmaceutical industry influence. There's little incentive to investigate permanent harms, and the broader cultural problem in medicine, over reliance on psychological explanations. Just that bias is baked into medical training that often prevents clinicians from engaging seriously around iatrogenesis. So it's just a perfect storm of ignorance, stigma, profit motives, epistemic arrogance, and yeah, all of that keeps PSSD in the shadows.
I've always said too, the medical system is in no rush to prove that these drugs that they're making such a profit on, they're not in a rush to prove that they're dangerous to some people. You
Yeah.
know, they're not really incentivized to do that. Uh, have you come across any PSSD patients or even PFS, or because I mean, you mentioned you also work with patients who have this from ashwagandha. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Have you come across any patients that have any physical changes from these drugs? Because I think PSSD, I mean, that tends to touch on the sexual aspect of this disease. That's only the tip of the iceberg, though, from people I've spoken to. The emotional blunting, the cognitive dysfunction. I've talked to people who have muscle loss from these things too, facial changes. And I've actually talked to a lot of professionals about this if they've seen that, and some have, some haven't. But just out of curiosity, have you seen any of these, any of your patients, have they had physical changes or anything like that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say there's a lot of people who don't, but a
Sure.
lot of people do. Just all kinds, yeah, all kinds of symptoms people report that they attribute to the medication, dramatic changes in their bodies,
Right.
from before and after, and that can range from joint problems,
Right.
a muscle loss, just complete change of um, yeah blood feeling of like blood,
Absolutely.
metabolic issues,
Yeah.
a range of neurological problems. um yeah I just the list goes on and on and on, and often people the name PSSD is so limiting because there's so much more going on with this
Right.
condition apart from the sexual dysfunction. And a lot of people find some of these other symptoms can get in the way of life even more than the sexual aspect.
Yeah.
So I
Absolutely.
think also the name can push people from, speaking out about it, because it's the extra
Yeah.
stigma of being around sexual dysfunction versus something like post-SSRI syndrome, where, if you can identify with some of the other symptoms, it doesn't hinge so much on the sexual dysfunction.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, what are some of the most common emotional challenges you see in clients dealing with PSSD?
Yeah, so the emotional challenges are really massive and layered. At the core, you have the direct emotional effects of the condition itself. So, like the anhedonia, the emotional blunting, and in some cases, a total collapse of emotional functioning. People describe feeling like a ghost of themselves, like they're watching life from behind glass. But on top of that, there's the psychological impact of the injury. So some people don't have the emotional injury, but for those who do, like there's um, that change. And then for most folks, just the psychological impacts, whether or not you have the emotional and cognitive symptoms. And that, of course, as you can imagine, grief, shame, isolation. There's often a profound identity crisis, because people often don't recognize themselves anymore. They're mourning the loss, of their sexuality, often their emotional life, their creativity, and more. And then there's often feelings of betrayal, profound betrayal, and mistrust. People often describe, the sense of betrayal by the medical system, people who prescribe the medication, sometimes by loved ones who don't understand or believe them. And that can lead to complex trauma, with layers of grief, loss, anger, mistrust, and existential despair. To be gaslit in your grief is just one of the most horrendous things that I think can happen to a person. And it takes a long time to recover from.
Yeah, I think dealing with the loss of yourself is probably one of the worst things in so many different ways. I mean, your sexuality, your personality, your cognitive abilities, if you're an extrovert, I mean, maybe you become more introverted at that point when you develop PSSD or PFS. I know I did. The body changes. I mean, it's such a loss of identity.
Yeah.
And to be dismissed, not just by medical professionals, but even family, friends. I've talked to a lot of people who their family members just don't believe that they're going through this.
Yeah.
It's just layer upon layer of suffering. And you can't even begin to explain to somebody just how devastating that is, obviously.
Yeah. It sounds hyperbolic to the uninitiated.
Yes, it does.
So people it's so hard communicating the the depths of this experience that, so many people just get this, this response of disbelief, which just really adds so much. People, like you say, there's just so much loss. And people often say they feel like they're mourning a death that no one can see. That really
essentially,
the invisibility of the condition. Like the world keeps turning, but for the person with one of these injuries, something really fundamental has died inside.
Yeah. And the lack of acknowledgement too. I mean, that's, again, the biggest part right there. You know, it's like if you had something like cancer or something that was recognized, at least you'd get sympathy from people. You know, they would tell you, hey, you have this. There would be at least hopefully some form of treatment plan that you could use. But with PSSD or PFS or post-Atkins syndrome or any of these diseases, I mean, there's no acknowledgement. And that lack of validation it just drives you further into despair. So
often people say like that's just as bad for them as the injury itself, is like that just complete, double trauma that happens when you realize you're in a world that won't affirm your reality around this, and just all of the loss of like relationships and connections when people are disappointed by those around them who don't support them. And even if people are supportive and believe the person, people often just don't know what to say because it's so alien and so foreign to them. There's no kind of roadmap for supporters, like the way, like you say, for other conditions, where it's like, okay, I've seen a movie on what happens when somebody gets this or this illness, and this is sort of like how you respond, and you kind of have a bit of a cultural script for it. With this, there's just nothing like that. People who are trying to support need to learn from the ground up and do a lot of education work to begin to try to really understand the gravity and the depths and the breadth of this problem.
Absolutely. So let me just look here. Are there any specific therapeutic tools you found especially helpful to people navigating the traumas and identity loss that PSSD can bring?
Yeah, so it really depends on the individual, but broadly, I draw from trauma-informed care and humanistic approaches and narrative therapy. I really like to support people to reclaim their story, and that can help because reclaiming authorship of their story in a world that is trying to erase or deny their experience, I think, is super important. Really, really starting with validation. And I sometimes integrate existential approaches or Stoic philosophy, especially when clients are grappling kind of with meaning making or limits to control. For clients who retain more emotional range, trauma processing and grief work can be really helpful and important. But it's all about, careful pacing. Sometimes people just don't have the emotional bandwidth, so that has to be respected. One thing I found is CBT, or cognitive behavior therapy, conventional kind of approach to supporting, to therapy can really backfire. And if somebody has a neurological injury or is feeling, cognitively impaired, trying to challenge their like cognitive distortions can feel like further gaslighting. And so, it's so important to be cautious with the frameworks used and to make sure that they fit with the lived reality of the person in front of me. Yeah. Somebody is giving the therapist trust, or, opening up to establishing trust after they've already been harmed by the mental health profession in particular, especially with, who've been put on SSRIs, it's such a delicate balance of really, rebuilding the trust with somebody who, is representative of a system that harmed them. So,
Absolutely. That's a really big challenge for you, I would imagine. I mean, like you said, there's no blueprint for navigating this either.
Yeah.
So how do you balance validating a client's suffering while also holding space for uncertainty, especially given how little is known about treatment or recovery timelines?
Yeah, that is such an important tension.
Right.
And I think about it a lot. I always start by fully acknowledging the reality of someone's suffering.
Yeah.
Not just in vague, like that sounds hard kind of way, but really affirming what they're experiencing, and that it's real, and that it's life altering, and it's been systemically dismissed. People need that firm grounding of validation before we can go to next steps of anchoring them and exploring what's ahead. At the same time, I'm careful not to pretend that I have answers or the recovery is guaranteed, because that would be another kind of betrayal, I think. And what I try to do instead is, frame the uncertainty as a shared space that we occupy together. Like, hey, we don't have all the answers, but you don't have to face that uncertainty alone. And then we can explore, okay, like, what does agency look like in this context? That might be participating in advocacy or connecting with community, even small acts of self-care or resistance that feel sustaining or meaningful, not because they'll fix the symptoms, but because they can affirm the person's kind of dignity. And so it's this dance between holding grief and realism, and while also staying open to possibility, because while we don't have established treatments, I've seen people improve, even people who've been suffering with symptoms for a long time. And the research is starting to emerge slowly. So I try to hold that space, that candle of possibility, while keeping kind of both feet planted in reality of the present.
And that is a really difficult question to answer. I recognize that, because, I'm sort of a therapist for people in some sense. They reach out to me asking me questions like, how long is this going to take? Am I going to recover? It's tough to answer, because everybody's recovery timelines are different, and some people don't recover. Some people end up getting worse for years on end, unfortunately. Yeah. I think, like you said, step number one, just validating their experience, not with just the general cliches like, oh, it's okay, or hey, that sounds terrible. It's really feeling what they're feeling, or attempting to, obviously. Yeah. That's going to be really difficult for you. I can relate, again, to a certain extent, because I talk to so many people in the PFS and PSSD communities, but we don't have a direct answer. And it's really, really difficult. So I appreciate how carefully you kind of tread between that line of wanting to validate and give them hope, but also be realistic about the situation as well.
It's a tough balance. And, there can be, I think, it's really important for people supporting people with this condition to be able to sit with their own helplessness and their own desire to do something to help, but not be able to. But yeah, when you start to sort of be overly kind of optimistic in a way that just doesn't feel grounded in reality for people, that can start to just make them feel seen, erased, gaslit, not heard. So
I never understood the term toxic positivity until I got into the PFS or PSSD community, and that for me, when people just try to give me so much reassurance, it'll be okay, you'll recover. I can't stand it. And they're trying to help. I understand that objectively, but it's like that type of narrative doesn't necessarily help,
Yeah, it's kind of like, actually, and it's about making the person saying it feel better, rather than helping the person who's living it feel seen and understood.
Yeah.
It can just feel like a glossing over of their problems without taking that time to really sit with them in what they're really dealing with. Like, if you're uneducated about this and you're just like, oh, it'll get better, like that just makes people feel completely erased again, because anybody who's educated themselves on this knows that they can't just say that blanket statement, you're going to get better, period. Right. It's not true. It might happen, but it might not.
Again, it's obviously contingent on the person. I think for a lot of people, it doesn't help. Maybe for a subset, it does, but you don't really know what to say in those situations. I mean, I was talking to a couple of friends recently, and even a family member, about this, and I didn't want to. They actually pressed me to talk about this. And so for 20 minutes, I opened up to them about everything I'm experiencing, everything I've gone through, the different layers of suffering, doing this channel moral medicine.
Yeah.
And the general response at the end from all of them was, oh, that sucks. That sounds horrible. And then it kind of got moved on. It's like, did you just listen to anything I've said over the past 20 minutes? And so it's almost easier not to talk about it, but then become more isolated by not talking about it. So there's like there's no proper way to go about this to try to cope with it. I don't know what to do half the time.
It's like this weird double bind. I find, speaking about my work, like in a lot of spaces I'm in, social settings, I don't want to talk about this that much, because then I have to deal with people's like reactions, finding out that PSSD exists. Half of the people in the room are on the drugs. Like, I can't,
Right.
like, it's, it's too like, it's sad, but it's just a lot of emotional energy
Yeah.
educating like a room of people about this and dealing with those reactions. So often I don't, unless I'm in the mood or whatever. But then
Sure.
when I do share, yeah, it's just often this, like, kind of like what you're sharing, you tell them about this and then people respond as if you told them what you ate for breakfast that morning.
Right.
And they're like,
Exactly.
oh, interesting. Next subject. You're like, I just told you that like a bomb dropped in,
Yeah.
the backyard. How are you
My life has been
walking
utterly
this
destroyed,
way?
and that's kind of your response to it, you know?
Yeah, it's like people can't emotionally integrate what you're telling them, or they just don't have the psychological and emotional equipment to respond in a way that really matches what you've shared. And so
Right.
that can just really add to the alienation that people experience who are in this world around just feeling like, yeah.
Yeah, that's why I think this channel is so important, because we have so many stories in this channel at this point. I was just telling, I think it was Joseph Wood During, I interviewed him
Yep.
recently, and I was telling him we have probably 60 to 70. I think I was saying 60 to 65 interviews. I think we're closer to 65 to 70 at this point, interviews in the channel. It gives people an opportunity to share their stories, talk to somebody who's going through it with them, and to see all these other stories where they can relate to what these people are going through. And I tell everyone to share this channel everywhere you can. Share it with your family members, share it with your friends, people who don't believe you, doctors who are gaslighting you. I mean, at some point, these public testimonials, they've got to hold weight, and they are holding weight. We're seeing it now, obviously, but
Yeah.
it's a long, strenuous process to get this acknowledged. But I think we're heading in the right direction here. It's just very tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just looking at the questions here. Let's see. In your experience, how willing are other mental health professionals to acknowledge PSSD as a real and serious condition?
It's mixed.
Sure.
Many clinicians are resistant, either because they just haven't encountered it or it challenges their frameworks too much. It requires a paradigm shift for a lot of people to see PSSD as a real neurological injury rather than just like a psychosomatic phenomenon or a spontaneous hysterical numbing of the genitals.
Right.
It's easier for some people to frame this as something like that rather than changing their assumptions and challenging their assumptions. I've seen a whole range of psychological origami that professionals have conjured up to avoid facing this uncomfortable reality and what it means for their practice. That said, I am seeing shifts. There's a small but growing number of clinicians who are learning, especially as we get more media attention and research starts to build. And so while resistance is still common, I do think there's a slow cultural change happening because the voices of the affected community are getting harder and harder to ignore.
Absolutely. And that's why I say it's so important for people to at least consider sharing their story publicly, because we have this documented record here of so many people who are suffering. And man, that's the toughest part for me, is going to, in my case, dermatologists and talking to them about post-finasteride syndrome, because they're the ones that typically prescribe finasteride.
Yeah.
And again, kind of going back to what we were talking about, it's the same thing. You tell them a 20-minute story about what you're going through, and they're like, oh, that's interesting. I got to look into that. It's like, I don't think you're understanding the gravity of this situation. Please. I went to a urologist about 6 months ago, gave him my 2-minute elevator spiel about everything I'm going through. Got a smirk on his face, could tell he wasn't really listening to me, didn't really believe me. And I told him, look up Moral Medicine, this channel I run. And he was kind of like, yeah, I'll do it at some point. So I actually wrote down on a sticky note and gave it to the front desk attendant. I said, please show this to the doctor and have him look it up. I don't think he ever did. It's so frustrating. It's like running on a hamster wheel half the time. It's like, why aren't you believing me, man? Like, I'm telling you everything I'm going through. Where there's so many documented records, please just look into this. And I think at some point, this is going to be considered one of the biggest medical scandals in history once this all comes out. And I think it's going to come out all at once, to be honest with you. It's just going to come flooding out, and people are going to be like, wow, I didn't realize this was happening. It's like, well, how did you not realize it? You know, people have been talking about this for years now. These medications have been on the market for, in some cases, 30, 40 plus years, with the SSRIs in particular. How has this gone? How's this been swept under the rug for so long? It's just, it's unbelievable. It really is.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And just that, that resistance to believing people and listening to patients. There's, I don't blame people for who've never heard about it and they're just, they're prescribing, as they've been taught or whatever. But once a patient comes and tells you and tries to hand you medical literature, the arrogance
Yeah.
involved in just completely dismissing their experience and refusing to look at this when there's person is suffering and telling you, firsthand, and it's not, there's enough information, there's enough medical literature now where it being in maintaining the denial position is unscientific.
Right. At this point, absolutely. And I think it's tough too, because I try to walk this line where I try not to demonize the medical system as a whole, right? Because then people are going to label you as a conspiracy theorist or a nutcase, whatever it might be. So I try to walk the line of not trying to badmouth the medical system, but acknowledge the gaps and the faults within it. And it's tough to convey that to people because, again, nobody wants to listen. The only people that want to listen are the ones who have been affected or they know someone that's been affected. And that's what amazes me too, is that these medications are so aggressively prescribed. I mean, worldwide, not just SSRIs, but Finasteride. And then we talked about the supplements, ashwagandha, saw palmetto. You can go down to your local CVS and pick those up right now. Take one pill and it ruins your life. It causes all these systemic effects for some people, not everybody, obviously. This is such a large issue, and I cannot believe it's been ignored for so long, and it's continuing to be ignored. Like you said, we're gaining traction at this point, but why does it have to take 15, 20, 30 plus years for doctors to finally acknowledge, wow, these medications, these supplements really are detrimental to a subset of people? And we don't even know the numbers, I don't think. I think I heard recently 1 in 7 people could potentially get PSSD. I don't know if you've heard that statistic before. If that is the case, that's a very large number of people, though. Even if it's 1%, I mean, when you have, millions of people taking these medications, that's still a large number in itself,
Yeah. So, that number is 13% of people. So that was actually a paper I published last year.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so 13% of past antidepressant users reported persistent genital numbness after stopping the drug compared to 1% of past users of other psychiatric drugs. So that's just a huge signal. It's not just a fluke. Of course, it's a spectrum disorder. So some people would have some genital numbness, but it's not so dramatic. They wouldn't immediately attribute it to the drug.
Right.
And then for some people, it's just super severe. They wake up one morning and it's like they've been completely altered. So, but I think saying at this point that PSSD is rare is a rhetorical sleight of hand to avoid further investigation and accountability. Even if it was 1% of people, that's a huge number because of how many people are put on these drugs.
Right.
And the reporting rates are so low for all of these reasons we've discussed, et cetera. So we don't have accurate prevalence numbers. Those studies don't exist. Like this is just an initial, this is one of the first pieces of like quantitative literature, but this isn't like an accurate prevalence study. It's like the beginnings. But we can't say that it's rare. We don't have that concrete information, and all the evidence shows that it's not as, uncommon as we might think. So one of my pet peeves is when people say this is rare.
It is for me too, because I also wonder how many people have taken these medications over the years, stopped them, and now they've been dealing with, persistent health side effects for years without connecting it to the drug.
Yeah.
We don't know those numbers either. Somebody might go in and they may say, hey, I've had brain fog for the past 10 years, not realizing that 10 years ago, they stopped taking an SSRI or they stopped taking Finasteride or they tried saw palmetto, and the doctors don't have a biomarker to determine, well, it's because of this or that. They assume it's psychosomatic as you talked about,
Especially, absolutely. And then especially people who are put on, who are nuked as children who never knew their baseline.
Right. Absolutely.
On some of these drugs so young. So there's so many factors that stop it from, the dots being connected.
100%. So I guess the next question here, what do you wish more psychiatrists or prescribers understood about the long-term psychological fallout of medication-induced harm?
Yeah, good question. I wish they understood how totalizing the impact can be.
Right.
And people are killing themselves because of this. And we're not just talking about erectile dysfunction. People think, PSSD, they just think sexual dysfunction. They think of that. We have a pill for that. No, we're talking about identity loss, relational breakdowns, complete disruption of one's future plans or dreams.
Yeah.
And the harm, it's not just biological, it's also psychological and social. When somebody's reality is denied by the world around them, by the prescriber, by the people who are meant to support them, that compounds trauma. And so people are not just left with that debilitating condition, they're also left questioning their reality,
Right.
their sanity.
Right.
I wish people knew the impacts of what can happen when people are gaslit in their grief. I wish psychiatrists knew, that like informed consent is not just a checklist. It's an ethical relationship.
Yeah.
And how important it is to document sexual functioning at baseline, warn patients about the risks of PSSD, and listening if persistent symptoms arise. These are ethical responsibilities, not optional extras.
Right.
And one last thing is, so often, this gets dismissed as depression, but I would say it's a minority of prescriptions for SSRIs that are actually for specifically depression.
Yeah.
Huge number of people will get put on these drugs for a range of other mental health problems,
Right.
as well as non-mental health problems like PMS or insomnia or chronic fatigue. And the mental health like the non-mental health problems and the mental health problems apart from depression that don't have genital numbness or anorgasmia or sexual dysfunction as a symptom profile. Like when you look at like OCD in the DSM, you don't see sexual dysfunction, but there's still this line of like, oh, it's just the depression returning until proven otherwise. It literally makes no sense to say that.
Right. It's easy for them to hide behind that too, because there is no direct biomarker as of now. I just want to go back to something you said earlier too. I've heard this before, and I think you said this earlier. They give sex offenders SSRIs to essentially cause genital numbness or to reduce their libido. Is that correct?
Yeah, to reduce libido. Actually, in the UK, there's been some controversy. The strain on the cost in the criminal justice system of keeping so many folks incarcerated has inspired some policy change to release folks who have committed sexual violence crimes back to their communities, and part of the community. The treatment order is being put on an SSRI in combination with another drug to curb libido. So that's kind of, just such a robust acknowledgement that we know what these drugs can do.
That's insane. So obviously those prescribers know that it's going to essentially cause low libido, and they're giving it to sex offenders to do so. But we don't necessarily get that acknowledgement from the medical system as a whole.
The main effect is sexual dysfunction, and then the other benefits or experiences people might have can be seen more as side effects. But the most robust, consistent effect of SSRIs is a dampening of one's sexuality.
I think if people really knew the risk they were taking with these drugs, I don't think anybody would take them. Some maybe a subset of people, but I think
I've never had because a lot of people, I see folks who in my practice who don't have PSSD. So that's a part of my practice, but not the entirety. And it's really common for people to, think, oh, am I going to SSRI? Work stressful, or, my pet died, or, some difficult life thing happens. It's normal, having a normal response, and somebody proposes an SSRI and we chat about it. I've never had somebody, then I tell them about PSSD. I've never had somebody decide to continue with that drug treatment after finding out about PSSD.
Yeah, absolutely. When you know the risk you're taking. I don't tell this story often. My wife ended up trying an SSRI probably about 3 years ago, and she got it from this, obscure website, and there was no consultation with a doctor. She basically went on, got this SSRI prescribed to her in like 5 minutes. I don't know if it was Prozac, it was something along those lines. She tried it for a few months, didn't like it, came off it. I recall telling her, how irresponsible is it that they're going to hand you this SSRI? I said, did you even speak to a doctor? She's like, no, I didn't speak to anybody. And they gave her this SSRI without ever speaking to a doctor. I don't know if there's probably a checklist she had to go through and, click, okay, I acknowledge the potential side effects. And the ironic part was that I was so amazed by this, and I was taking Finasteride at that time. And I basically had gone through the same process to get Finasteride. I just didn't know Finasteride caused so many detrimental effects. And I was dealing with serious effects at that point. I was investigating what the hell is going on with my mental state, with my psychological, my neurological state as a whole, because I was slurring my words. I couldn't speak. I couldn't connect. So I was going through essentially PFS without realizing it. And then I was astonished by the fact that she received an SSRI so easily online. It just goes back to how easily these medications are prescribed to people. And it really does blow my mind.
Yeah, it's mind blowing. Just the 5-minute appointment with a prescription pad. Even when people do speak to a doctor, they're like, nobody's warned. Nobody's warned
Right.
about these risks. People are very, very, very few people are even told about the sexual effects while on the drug.
Yeah.
Let alone persistent problems.
If you just put the word permanent on any medication, I think that would deter 95% of people from even taking it. Even if it was just permanent, I don't know, dry eyes, I don't know, anything. If you see permanent, it's like, I don't want to go through a permanent change just to address something that I could probably address in other ways.
Saying something may persist is different than like can be irreversible or maybe permanent in some people. Yeah.
Absolutely. So what role do you think therapists can play in helping shift the culture around psychiatric medication and patient consent?
Yeah, great question. So I think therapists have a unique role because we're often the ones who hear about the long-term consequences of treatment decisions that maybe medical professionals don't always see. Often medical professionals, it's a one-time appointment or 2 appointments with a specialist or a GP. They're not building like an ongoing, enduring, meaningful relationship with the person and hearing about the impacts on their lives and really taking hours to learn from the person.
Right.
So we're in a role where we really have a lot of time to really learn about the person's life and their experience. So I think we can really advocate for, like the practice of knowing our limits to knowledge, revising our own beliefs when new evidence or perspectives arise. Because, the evidence, it's so crucial in clinical work because the evidence base, where the evidence base is incomplete, like with these conditions. And so we can educate clients about informed consent, what it really means, talking to their prescribers, red flags to watch out for. And on a broader level, we can shift clinical culture by bringing stories of iatrogenesis to professional spaces,
right.
Whether that's supervision, continuing education, research. The more the conversations can happen, the less room there is for denial and dismissal. And if people who, with letters behind your name and certain credentials are speaking of this, it adds credibility when we're still in the credibility establishment kind of phase with this, unfortunately. So the more people that speak out, and to healthcare providers or, researchers or medical professionals or therapists, et cetera, if you're scared to speak to your colleagues about this because you're scared of their reaction or being seen like you're a Scientologist or something, think about how hard it is for the patients.
Right. Absolutely.
So we're in a privileged position.
Mm-hmm.
So I really call on colleagues to put their, discomfort and egos aside and really speak truth to power, because you're in a unique position to have a platform that patients don't have access to in the same way.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I think a lot of mental health professionals or just doctors in general, they don't want to speak out about this, even if they have a patient who's coming to them and saying, "Hey, I'm experiencing X, Y, and Z." I mean, is it egotistical based? Is it just a lack of belief? Is it a combination of both? I'm just trying to figure out, why aren't doctors talking about this more with their colleagues? I've had a couple, but very few.
Yeah, it seems like it's the minority. I think it takes a certain amount of willingness to go against the grain, to challenge, the status quo. It takes moral courage. It takes like a certain like robust, confident personality structure to be able to do that. And I think, it just, you have to be willing to be the outlier. And there's a lot of people in whatever setting it is, that just have a lot of fear and resistance to putting themselves on the line to do that. And it's unfortunate because, again, there's enough media attention and medical literature now to be able to say something like that. But
I'm thinking about making a printout for moral medicine that consolidates all the PFS and PSSD studies and then references the channel and has a couple examples of people who have gone public that people can possibly just take to their doctors and show them like a packet, essentially, just going through everything that they can hand to the doctors and say, "Hey, just take a look at this." I've thought about it. I think that might be a good idea. I know the PSSD network and I think the PFS network has something similar, but I talk about it with every doctor I go to, even when I know they're not going to believe me. I'm at least going to put the bug in their ear just to feel like I did something. And who knows? It's almost like being an entrepreneur and like knocking on 1,000 doors, and at
Yeah.
some point someone's going to finally accept your product and listen to you. I think it's the same thing here. We just have to continue being persistent with it and letting
Yeah.
doctors know, even if it is uncomfortable, even if we do feel like they're going to gaslight us or laugh at us, say it. Just talk about it. You
Yeah.
got nothing to lose by
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah, and it's like like a tricky bind, because if you're in that situation, it can feel sort of like a self-betrayal, or
Sure.
of not speaking out. But then if you do speak out, then you're risking exposing being minimized and gaslit again, which can be like triggering and re-traumatizing for people. So it's this like
Right.
between a rock and a hard place situation.
It is.
I absolutely know no shame or blame on people who just can't stomach
Sure.
speaking out to medical professionals after they've been erased or dismissed or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do find a lot of people feel like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right.
But yeah, I definitely fall on the side of, well, if you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, then do. Because you never know, maybe again in 5 years that doctor will hear from somebody else, and then another 5 years, and then they'll start to believe people. Or maybe you're just going to stumble upon somebody who
Hmm.
really is super ethical and engaged and cares. And yeah, I've found speaking out about what I do in professional settings, yeah, I've been really touched. I've been disappointed a lot of the time, but I've also been touched by people who
Hmm.
care and really understand the gravity of this, people maybe I wouldn't have expected. So
Yeah.
yeah, it is kind of just this like gamble that you take. And
Yeah. Like you said, you in my mind, you have nothing to lose. You may as well say something. And it doesn't make talking about it easier, because especially like you said, when you're probably going to be gaslit by the professional, it just reinforces this notion of like, why am I even saying anything to begin with? But I'm persistent. I feel like at some point, like I said, somebody is going to respond to this, and hopefully it's the right person, and they can build enough awareness. Maybe they have an interest in trying to conduct some research for this. I just think
yeah.
we have nothing to lose by doing it. So this kind of leads to the next question here. What kind of feedback or response have you gotten from speaking out publicly about PSSD and iatrogenic harm? And has it been mostly supportive, resistant, or mixed? And I think from what you've told me, it's kind of been a mix in some sense.
Yeah, a mix.
Yeah.
On one hand, I've received a lot of gratitude by people affected, because it's rare to feel seen in the space.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, yeah, some healthcare professionals has been resistant or dismissive. And yeah, like I said, when you're challenging established paradigms, especially ones backed by powerful industries, there's going to be pushback. And
Right.
yeah, I've experienced a lot of alienation in certain clinical spaces when I've spoken up about this, which is frustrating. But yeah, it kind of reaffirms the need to continue to, counteract the ignorance and arrogance that
Right.
exists in the mental health field about these issues. Um, and yeah, that said, there are signs of change. Some professionals are wanting to learn more and figure out how to support their own clients better. So yeah, the conversations are starting to open up slowly but surely. I think there's some people that are just going to be the last to the party. But there are clinicians that they find out about this. Therapists, sexual medicine folks, folks who aren't engaged directly in prescribing, or allied health like nursing, midwifery,
Mm-hmm.
social work, counseling. I think those are professions that aren't as threatened by the finding out about the existence of this, because they're not their bread and butter. Their livelihood doesn't depend on finding out these pills. They don't have to grapple with realizing that, oh my gosh, maybe I was, harming people for all these years by not
Sure.
offering informed consent. It's more confronting to prescribers who were really handing these drugs out every day. Even like I find certain specialists are more likely to be receptive,
Mm-hmm.
like a gynecologist who's
Sure.
handing out these drugs every day versus a GP kind of
Right.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost this cognitive dissonance. I mean, you don't want to ever admit that the drugs you've been handing out have been causing so much destruction for a subset of the patients that have been prescribed them, and have, even led to suicides in some cases. So I guess you can kind of understand their position, but it doesn't it doesn't make our position any easier, you know.
No.
Um, it's very difficult, and no, I appreciate you you answering that. So the final question here is, what gives you hope when working in the field, especially with something as complex and underacknowledged as PSSD?
Yeah, so I find a lot of hope in just seeing the resilience, resistance of people in this community. People are finding ways to live with this unimaginable loss and still show up for each other and still fight for recognition and justice. I've also seen improvements. I really have. I've
Sure.
witnessed people who've regained some emotional or sensory function even after several years. And so it is possible, and that does matter.
Absolutely.
Like I said before, there's no guarantee that it's going to happen for everybody. For some people, it doesn't get better, but for some people, it really does. And yeah, I see hope in the growing awareness, conversations like this one, podcasts, research studies are starting to trickle in. There are clinicians who are willing to rethink
Sure.
what they thought they knew. Every adverse event reported, which doesn't take long. If you're watching this and you haven't died in yours, please do it. Every
Right.
personal story heard,
Yeah.
there's movement and increased media attention as well. There's been
Mhm.
some shifts just in the last 6 months in a big
Yeah.
way. So yeah, it's slow work, but yeah, vital.
I couldn't agree more with that. I try to encourage as many people to speak out as they can, and it's difficult to do because I never want people to feel pressured to speak out. So I just try to highlight the consequences of what can happen if we do speak out, and the consequences of what can happen if we don't speak out. And if we don't speak out, the consequences, this continues being brushed under the rug, more people get injured, and we have less of a chance of, finding a biomarker and hopefully finding a treatment at some point for all
Yeah.
these issues. So no, really well said. I really appreciate that. Before we hop off, Yassi, do you have anything else you'd like to tell the audience or any closing statements?
Um, yeah, just if you are out there and you're suffering, know that you're not alone. Your suffering is real. It's not your fault. And it's not a reflection of weakness or personal failing.
Right.
What's happened to you is just a freak reverse lottery situation.
Yep.
You don't deserve it. And yeah, there really is change happening. I think in 5 years, the global conversation around this is going to be different. So just hang in there.
I agree with that. Yeah. Yassi, thank you so much for coming on the channel. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mark.